Welcome to the Hazmat Guys Podcast. This is the podcast where I get to ask my stupid questions to some of the smartest people in and around the world of emergency services. My guest this week is a retired member of Hazmat One from FDNY. He is one of my bosses. He is one of the co-hosts of the Hazmat Guys Podcast, all around hazmat guru, one of the finest instructors in the world. My guest this week is Mike Monaco, and I'm gonna preface it with this. This is actually one of the first episodes we ever recorded. We've been waiting, filling in with guests, waiting to finally release this episode. But it actually predates the Wheel of Stupid Questions, so you're not going to see a Wheel of Stupid Questions this week. If you want to see me and Mike argue about a really stupid question, tune back into an episode I released just a couple weeks ago with him and Mike and Bobby, rather. And we have a discussion about how many holes a straw has, and it kind of takes a turn. It's pretty fun. But this week, we're not going to have a Wheel of Stupid Questions, but we are going to have a really awesome conversation, so tune in. Mike.
Good morning.
How are you?
I am doing phenomenal. I love the intro.
Yeah. You'd be amazed what you can buy for $100 from India.
I know exactly what you can buy for $100 from India.
Yeah. All right. So as the format of the podcast goes, Mike has no idea what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the physical and chemical properties of flammability. Right. So this is new news to Mike. He's flexing. He's getting ready to flex some mind grapes.
I got my Google up, got my AI ready to go.
Yeah. Okay. So here is the first question up here. What are the physical and chemical properties that create the flammable range? If you had to pick the ones, obviously we know the UEL, the LEL, that is the flammable range, but what pieces and components actually make that up?
Okay, so like so many parts of hazmat information and science information, we've got a lot of different dots, and it's connecting those dots that kind of end up making sense. So what are the chemical and physical properties that are associated with flammability? So first you're going to have obviously reactivity, because in order for something to react with oxygen, there has to be a reactivity possibility there. So that's going to be one of our first chemical and physical properties. Is it going to undergo that kind of that redox reaction where it's going to have a sharing of electrons with the oxygen, and then in that process create a new molecule plus heat and light and fire and all that happy stuff. So I guess that would be one. You have to have the reactivity. The second one is you have to have the oxygen and the fuel available. And while we understand that in the LEL, UEL, too much fuel, too little fuel, rich, too lean, and stuff like that. The whole concept that first the fuel has to make it to the oxygen is something that people sometimes disconnect. So when we take a look at, say, diesel versus gasoline, we see that diesel has a much higher flash point, a much higher ignition temperature, all that stuff. And that is fundamentally due to not the reactivity, but the vapor pressure of the product. So the vapor pressure is going to be the measure of how quickly that product goes in the air. And it isn't until it's in the air that it gets to mix with the oxygen and even has the potential to react, because it can't react with oxygen if it's not even with the oxygen to begin with. So those are going to be some of the main components that go into the, quote, chemical and physical properties that push for flammability.
Yeah. Okay. You touched on one of the next questions I kind of had laid out for you, which is the relationship between vapor pressure and flammability. Obviously, as we increase our vapor pressure, we increase the amount of combustible gases from the surface of a liquid, and that gets us to the flammable range easier. Sure. When we add that vapor pressure to other physical and chemical properties, is this really a big driving force of getting us to the LEL, or is this kind of a secondary factor? Because when I think about it, I think of it as, obviously the more vapor production we have,
the easier we're going to get to that LEL. But that LEL can fluctuate quite a bit depending on what the product is.
Absolutely. So in order to understand, right, this kind of goes into the more of a three-dimensional concept of flammability, right? Where it's not often we look at flammability, we draw a line across the whiteboard and we go, okay, here's 0 and here's 100, 100% and 0%, and you get a little more fuel and you have this kind of this two-dimensional graph. But in reality, LEL is very much, three-dimensional, and we should think of LEL dimensional, because it's not so much that as we increase our vapor pressure, we're getting easier or harder to reach the LEL. That happens to be true, but we are also shifting the location of the LEL, which is something that we need to think about more. Like if we look at something that is already a pure gas and it is coming out of, say, a pipe, and it's coming out extremely fast under pressure, let's say like a high pressure natural gas line, right? We know that then LEL exists, but it's a matter of where that LEL is, because it's being pushed. There's so much volume being pushed up and out that it doesn't have a chance to mix with the air until you're 3-4 feet above the leak. The same thing can be almost true for flammable liquids that are producing high vapor pressures. You can be producing so much vapor pressure that in the area of the surface or the opening of the container, there's actually not enough oxygen to mix with the fuel. So it's not that it's easier or harder to reach the LEL. The LEL almost always exists if we have a leak. It's a matter of where that LEL is in relation to us coming into the scene. Is it, if it's a lower LEL, assuming that you have enough to even create an LEL, a lower vapor pressure, that LEL zone is going to be closer to the surface. Higher LELs, you're going to have higher vapor pressures. You're going to have an LEL that's potentially further away from the surface, which means that you can actually reach that flash point quicker when you consider like entering a room and going towards the leak or the spill. You're actually going to hit that UEL, LEL zone a lot faster. So if you think of it like a three-dimensional model versus just do we have an LEL or don't we have an LEL, you can almost like create this little bubble in your head as far as where the LEL and UEL zones might be in relation to that flammable spill.
Yeah. So that's a thing that I talk about often when I'm teaching LEL, UEL is like, probably seen I might have learned it from you at one point, the blowtorch. And you look at the blowtorch and now here's your UEL because we don't have a flame. And now we have the flame. And then beyond that, we have a two lean situation. Does that extrapolate out even farther when we have a large scale spill? Is a product with a large flammable range literally going to have more space where it's in the flammable range? If you think about it in three dimensions, like the larger the flammable range, the larger the space physically that would be in the flammable range. So I guess
we have to first create the scenario and then put that spill in the scenario, because I could say yes and then I could say no, right? Because I could turn around and it depends is your answer, right?
Yeah, there's the hazmat phrase of the week, right? Yeah.
If I have this, let's say acetone, right? Acetone is about 180, got a pretty decently high vapor pressure. And we are going to see this in a confined space as filling that space with vapor and potentially pushing out the oxygen. So if it's in an enclosed space, if that space is so enclosed that those vapors can fill the space, then we're looking at a UEL situation, not necessarily an LEL situation. But at some point, in order to get to the UEL, you first have to cross through the LEL and the flammable range. So now you have time as a factor as well. So you've got time. You've got ventilation, you have the ability for oxygen to get in and out. So if your ventilation is extremely confined, then you're going to have a totally different oxygen to fuel ratio than if you were just, say, out in the open, right? If we take that same spill and we put it out in the street, then we're almost guaranteed to have a zone. And if we add wind to that, we're almost guaranteed to have that zone a lot lower because, you know, if you think of that as that three-dimensional, like where that zone is, it's almost being pushed by the wind. So really all the situations, all the different situations that you could have an LEL, UEL zone are so dependent on the environment and the atmosphere that we can create an idea of what's going on, but it isn't until we break out our meters that we can actually start to define what is really happening, right? Because we take that theory and then we take the reality and we kind of put them together and we see what the difference is, right? If we walk in and we go, oh, we've got a diesel spill and there shouldn't be any kind of LEL, and we walk in and it's saturated with fuel, well, my theory and my reality, they're not matching up. So that LEL zone can be changed by so many different things. But yes, in general, if we keep all of the same factors together, then something with a higher vapor pressure has the potential to have not a wider range in percentage of atmosphere, but an actual physical distance.
Yeah. So that brought up another thing that I think is interesting and kind of misunderstood, which is when we have, a flammable liquid release, we know that all but just a few of those vapors are going to be heavier than air in terms of vapor density. What is the process in which that material stacks up on itself to move from the floor up? And what are some of the factors that stack into that? Like to say, oh, I expect this to be 1 inch from the ground versus 10 inches from the ground versus a foot, whatever that might be.
So you have your density. But what a lot of people fail to realize is that the density that we see is also controlled by temperature, right? Density is a dual, it's a dual variable circumstance. It's the amount of weight over a certain volume. So I can change my weight and I can change my volume, and that's going to change my density. And quite often temperature does that, right? It changes the density of stuff. Perfect example is, where does CO go? Does it go up or down? What is the vapor pressure? What is the vapor density of CO?
Yeah, 0.96. It's kind of this miscible gas, right?
It goes up, but yet over and over again, I'll ask firefighters, all right, you have a fire in a private dwelling. Where do you end up finding the most CO? In reality, when you're walking around, is it the top floor, the fire floor, or the basement? And over again, they'll go, we've got accumulation in the basement. I say, yeah, but that doesn't make sense, right? We just talked about density. We just talked about that 0.9. Where should it be? They go, well, it should be on the second floor. I said, well, is your theory matching your reality? And they're saying no. I said, okay, well, then what's missing in your theory? What is it that you failed to take into account? And for something like the CO, it's going to be those temperature changes, right? The temperature changes the density, the relatives, all that stuff comes into play. The water, the air, the heat, the smoke, and it changes all the relative density and throws our CO into the basement.
How does ventilation profile play into that, considering that most basements probably have a limited ventilation compared to other floors? Do you think that plays a factor into that as well?
The chemical is able to, once it gets in there, it's difficult to get out. Right, just like if we had the flammable liquid in a confined space area, we're going to have a massive buildup of vapors, and you have depending on that vapor pressure, the potential of actually being in the UEL, which is why we are so careful when we ventilate confined spaces to realize that if we're in the UEL, we have to now pass through that explosive range in order to get down below the LEL. We often do not see UEL situations in well-ventilated areas, right? Unless you're right at the surface of even a gasoline spill, and I mean right at the surface, is the only time that you're gonna, you go above even potentially go above the UEL. And even that we understand is not even being realistic, because as long as I have the right temperature, I can almost always take a match, throw it into gasoline, and it lights up. So that idea of the confined space dramatically changes how we look at the buildup of the molecules that are coming off of. Now, when it comes to how they build up on top of each other, right? The molecules are always going through this balancing act. Everything with chemical physical properties is a balancing act. So you have this concept of entropy, which is disorder and chaos and things wanting to spread away from each other. You have the forces of gravity that are pulling things down on each other, and then you have the ventilation of fresh air, and then temperature changes and things along those lines that can cause differences in density, and all those things come together, plus more, come together to create the situation. And okay, is this vapor going to hang down low, or is it going to dissipate in the air? Am I going to get higher readings at the ceiling, higher readings down at the floor? Is it going to change as I go in between? How evenly is this chemical dispersing throughout this room or this field or this situation? So there are so many different variables that go into play when we talk about diffusion, which is the technical term for what we're describing, that the best we can do is make an educated guess as to what we predict is going to happen, and then walk in there with our meters and see if theory and reality coincide.
Yeah. So that brings me straight to the next one. When we think about metering, talk to me about the causation of why some flammable gases are more and less reactive to cat bead sensors. So if we're looking at our CGI, obviously we have different flammable ranges and vapor pressures, all these factors why, you're going to be able to get a reading on your CGI, but some are more and some are less sensitive, and they have huge, correction factors or not so much. What are the things you're looking at?
All right. So I think what you're asking is, why can I have such a difference in my CGI for one chemical versus another chemical? Correct. Okay.
Correct.
So that answers is you have to focus on the technology itself. And this is why it's so important to not just say, hey, this meter picks up hydrocarbons, is to understand how it's picking up the hydrocarbons, right? Or the chemical, the chlorine gas, the electrochemical sensor, the flame spectroscopy, whatever it is. It's so important to understand how it ticks, because then you can understand things like that question. So the fundamentals of the CAD bead sensor, which is totally different than the IR sensor, which is one of the latest technologies in that explosive or flammable metering, is that it uses heat and voltage resistance to determine how much product is in the sample. So as it oxidizes and as it burns, you have a molecule like methane that, and I don't know what the heat numbers are, so I'm going to just kind of make it up, right? Let's say that one molecule of methane, or let's do percentages of the atmosphere, percentages, right? 1% of methane in the air can produce a change of 1 British thermal unit, right? Which increases the temperature of your CAD bead. As the CAD bead increases in temperature, the resistance across the resistors changes, which changes your amperage and your voltage, and the meter is able to turn around and calculate all that. So as I decrease the amount of methane, I'm decreasing the amount of heat going into the catalytic bead, and I'm changing the voltage. If I have the same molecule or the same percentage of molecule, let's say again 1%, let's go with diesel fumes. Diesel vapors, 1% in the air. Well, that 1% is going to produce a tremendous amount more energy than 1% of methane. As a result, my CAD bead sensor is going to be at a higher temperature, burning or oxidizing the diesel fumes versus the methane fumes, which is going to cause an increased temperature on the diesel versus the methane. And the meter, all the meter is doing is reading the change in the voltage, the change in the resistance. So it sees it as more product than what is actually there when it's compared to like methane versus diesel. So that's why we have our conversion charts. That's why we can have such a difference in methane versus diesel when we turn around and we work all those conversions. It's because the heat given off by the molecule when it's burning is so much more, say, on the diesel side than it is on the methane side. Does that make sense?
Interesting.
Okay.
Yeah. No, it does. Yeah. Yeah. So going down further on the catalytic bead sensor, sometimes these sensors have cross sensitivities, things like that we can use to our benefit. Is there anything in your experience that you can use a CGI for that's non-typical? That's not like, I know I'm supposed to be looking for flammable vapors, but it can also be helpful with this. And this could be a dumb question, and that's kind of what the whole point of the podcast is, right? Asking the stupid shit, right?
The only one that I know of that would be fairly common, believe it or not, is helium. Helium, for whatever reason, produces a jump in the CGI, which is really cool. As an instructor, I can kind of create a flammable environment without creating a flammable environment. I don't know why, and I honestly don't know how, but I know that if you put the CGI to helium, you will get a change in your LEL.
And everyone sounds like Mickey Mouse in the class, which is fun.
And if you put too much in, then everybody gets an experience on asphyxiation, right?
Yeah, which could be fun.
Listen, it's a great way to get a medal, right? You went in and you pulled out 30 students, and you look like a hero.
Yeah. And you don't have to mention that it was your fault in the first place. That's okay.
It's just these guys passed out. I don't know why they passed out. They were just down.
Yeah. I don't know. Just remember that I saved 30 of them. That's what matters. Okay. So we're going to backtrack just a slight bit because we jumped over some stuff when we were talking physical and chemical properties as we came down this. But I've always struggled to explain one concept to students that I teach in this. And it's straightforward enough to give them the 10,000 foot view, but I don't understand exactly the minutia, which is auto ignition. So we've produced enough vapors and we've increased the ambient temperature so much that now things just pop off. Explain that better than I just did.
Well, all right. So I guess the question is why do we always think there needs to be a flame? Like, what is it about the flame that is, the flame started the fire, right?
Yeah.
Because if we understand that it's not about the flame, right? The flame doesn't do anything. What is the flame? What is the flame in a fire, Jake?
Heat?
Well, it is heat.
Or you're talking about like oxidation, you're saying?
What is it, right? I have, if I had a picture of a campfire, right, I would see the wood at the bottom, I would see the flame, and then I would see the smoke coming out. So what is happening that there's flame right there? Like, what is the flame?
The flame is a rapid oxidation and giving off of light.
Yes.
Through the production. There we
giving
go.
Off of light. It's the area in this whole chemical reaction in which light is being given off. Right. And we could get into the whole physics of how that happens, but that's really not the important part. The important part is it's just the area of the chemical reaction that's producing light. So what we're actually seeing in that chemical reaction is a tremendous amount of heat being given off. The flame starting a fire doesn't have anything to do with the light, and it has everything to do with the heat. Okay. For intent and purposes, the gasoline is blind, right? Let's say we're lighting gasoline on fire, right? The gasoline is blind. It doesn't know that a flame is coming towards it. What is happening is the heat from that reaction that we see as flame. We see that light as flame. That heat is enough heat to cause the gasoline molecules to react with the oxygen molecules. There's something called activation energy in chemistry, where things always want to be at a lower state. But in order to get it to the lower state, in order to cause it to react, I first have to push a little bit of energy into the system to get the reaction going. The greater the amount of heat required to put into the material, the greater the activation energy, the harder it is to ignite. We see this in a diesel is a really good example. When you're doing live fires at the fire training, can you just go over to a pit of diesel and throw a flare in it and light it up?
No, it doesn't want to ignite
doesn't
really
want
well.
to ignite.
Yeah.
It has a very high activation energy. So what do I need to do? I need to put gasoline in there. And yes, some of this is vapor pressure and mixing with oxygen and stuff like that. But some of it is also diesel's a very large molecule. So you require a specific amount of energy put into the system in order to get it to the point that it's going to react and then release the energy and go into a more stable state. So when I'm putting the flame up to the gasoline, I am putting heat in the form or energy in the form of heat into the system that's causing it to reach its activation energy, which then allows it to react with the oxygen if it has sufficient vapor pressure and the mixture is right and all that other stuff. Auto ignition is me putting heat into the system without visible flame. Without a visible source of ignition. I've already heated it up to the point that it is no longer needing a push. It's at the top of that activation hill. Enough energy is already in the system. All I need to do is introduce oxygen and the chemical is going to react by itself. That is auto ignition. You can think of the same thing as if I take, you ever burn food in the oven? Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Unfortunately,
right?
Yeah.
So if I burn food in the oven, there was no source of ignition for that food, right? That food hit its auto ignition temperature. I put so much energy in the form of radiant heat from the oven that the molecules started reacting with the oxygen in the air, which then produced more heat, and you get this positive feedback cycle. So auto ignition is literally, it's already at the temperature. It has enough energy to react with the oxygen all by itself. And different substances are going to have different auto ignition temperatures. And if I have a substance that has an auto ignition temperature that's way down at room temperature, we consider those things to be spontaneous combustion, right? It's not really spontaneous combustion. The room, there's nothing special about that material. Its activation energy just happens to be the energy required at room temperature. So it's already there. I don't have to push it to do anything. It's going to do it by itself.
Is that energy that you're adding always going to be in the form of heat, or could you have another source, say the activation energy? Is there another source that activation energy could come from? Is that, and we might be getting a little bit off track here, but say in terms of something that is shock sensitive or something like that. Is that a similar thing?
It's the exact same thing, right? It's the when you have something like TATP, triacetone triperoxide, and it is quote unquote shock sensitive. Yeah, you're literally that energy, and now instead of being in the form of heat, is in the form of mechanical energy. So that hitting of the substance is enough energy to get the ball rolling. So yes, you can have mechanical energy and you can have thermal energy. I don't know on a molecular level if the two become the same, right? Because the only reason that heat energy is what it is because the vibration of one molecule slams into another molecule, right? So I don't know if that mechanical push on a molecular level ends up being very similar to just a high temperature.
Interesting. All right, we're gonna wrap things up and let Mike get on with his day. I super thank you for coming and sharing some of your experience and knowledge with us today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having.